Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, throughout this campaign, we're going to be going through a lot of the big issues that are coming up here, some of the claims that we're hearing about from the parties, and also just giving you a sense of the state of the economy, the state of the country right now. And as you mentioned, immigration, it is one of the big issues in this election. We're going to be hearing a lot about it. We've heard a lot about it from all of these people, from these party leaders. We'll hear more about it, I imagine. But there are also lots of misconceptions about migration. So before we get to the particular kind of claims and policies that we are hearing about today, let's just go through some of these misconceptions. There's three of them, really, that you might hear about a lot, and you're wondering, well, are they actually true? And a lot of people saying this is all about small boats. So the migration story is mostly about small boats. It's not quite right, OK? It's not just small boats. Let me just show you the numbers on this, OK? Small boats, this is just back last year. We're looking at the full year numbers for 2023. Small boats, you're talking just under 30,000 people coming in on small boats. Very high in historical kind of proportion, but nonetheless, compare that to the overall numbers for asylum seekers, and that's significantly higher, 81,000. Now compare that to, for instance, people coming in to study, and look at this bar, OK? That's up by 379,000. So just look at the difference between them. And then look at the number of people coming in to work in that year, 423,000. And then you've got other reasons as well. Add it all up and you're talking about over 1 million people coming in. Small boats, really only a small fraction of that. Of course, very visible, lots of talk about it. But in the big picture here is about something else entirely. Also, another misconception, some people are saying, well, isn't this mostly about numbers of people coming in from Ukraine and Hong Kong? Well, definitely that has been a factor, OK? But let me just compare overall reasons. This is people coming in from all over the world, outside of Hong Kong, outside of Ukraine. Big numbers there. Now add on Ukraine and Hong Kong, and you can see while it is pretty sizable, it is small in comparison with this other big mass of migration. That's immigration that we've seen into the UK. Final misconception. More broadly, some people have been looking at these numbers and saying, listen, there's nothing abnormal happening at the moment. You know, migration numbers, they're basically in line with where they have been for some time. Well, that is absolutely not wrong either. This is showing you total net migration, so the number of people coming in minus the number of people going out, going back as a percentage of the population, so it's comparable, going back to 1855. OK, so this is a very, very long-range thing. Anyone going out is above the line, anyone coming in, rather, going in above the line, and when more people are leaving, that's below the line. Look at the line here in the last few years. Just look at what's happened to net migration. We have never seen it as high as it is right now. That is a historic high going back more than 150 years. So that is very striking indeed. And it's worth just keeping all of that in mind when we go on to some of these pledges. When it comes to the pledges, OK, so the latest one we've had is from Rishi Sunak. And he says the plan on immigration is working, but migration levels are still too high, so we're going further. We have a clear plan to stop the boats and put a legal cap on numbers. Now, as I was saying, the boats is, relatively small in terms of the grand scheme of things. This legal cap is interesting. The problem is what we haven't heard from Rishi Sunak is what is that cap actually going to be? So we don't know what it's going to be. They say that it's going to be decided at each parliament. But it's worth just going back and looking back at the history of caps, because we have had caps on net migration. Most notoriously, David Cameron said that he wanted to keep net migration into the tens of thousands. And so that was a cap that existed in that period. Theresa May kept it as well. Look at the line, look at the dotted line. Did that work? Well, let's bring on the numbers. No, it didn't. So at no point in that period did that cap on migration actually was it met. Now, Boris Johnson then came in. He actually kind of got rid of the cap, but he had he wanted a constraint. He had a points-based system. Ironically, that was actually the one period where the numbers did go down below where that cap was, largely because of COVID. Then you had Brexit coming in, post-Brexit rules came into force, and just look at what happened to net migration after those Brexit rules came into force. So post-Brexit, a lot of people thought Brexit was all about trying to get migration down. In fact, the opposite actually happened. Final thing to say, it's not just Rishi Sunak we've heard from on this, it's also this man, Nigel Farage. He says, I said this just today, that net migration shouldn't be capped, it should be zero. And that raises another question. When was the last time that net migration was zero? And if we look back at this chart, same thing, net migration, that's people kind of more when the number of people coming in outnumbers those who are going out. The red bars are showing you when there's more people leaving the country. And you can see, yes, there were moments where there was basically zero net migration. Look at this one, OK? So that's 1992 to 1993. That was when the UK was in recession, OK? There was a period here, 1998, when there was freedom of movement. Suddenly there was an Immigration Act, the UK, it meant that people from the UK could go out and work in the EU. Then you've got negative net migration. And then there's this large period, actually for most of the post-war period, the UK had negative net migration. More people leaving than coming in. But at the time, people weren't thinking that was a good news story. They thought it was a bad news story. It's because people didn't want to come to the UK. They wanted to leave. They wanted to find work elsewhere. And people were fretting about the brain drain. So it's certainly true that it has happened in the past. It's certainly true these numbers here are unprecedented. And I showed that chart earlier, going back to 1855. And it's certainly true that you could get kind of either zero or negative net migration. But it's definitely more of an economic story about how the economy is doing rather than any caps that have been in place over that period.
Ed, it's absolutely fascinating analysis as always. I mean, my main question is, if we were to go back to that first chart, which broke down where the numbers came from, over 1 million for 2023 and what the breakdown was, the biggest bar, I think, was people coming into work. And,
yes.
And
have a look.
If you were to remove that, what would be the result? Presumably, at least a chunk of that would be jobs not filled, as opposed to jobs filled by domestic workers. I mean, talk to us about the demographic position and whether we need people to come in to fill those jobs, or else the alternative is almost a like-for-like trade-off of unemployment rising? Well,
I think that's a really good point. And some people would say, actually, you shouldn't really include the study numbers. So this is students coming into the UK and their dependents. OK, so there's a question mark, as you know, about kind of a third of that is dependents and kind of slightly more than that is dependents. So, you know, wives, partners, children is a part of those bars. Some people say you shouldn't really include that because that's people who are coming in for a few years. But as you point out, this is the big one. OK, and this comes back to that broader point about that last chart I was showing you. You know, it's nice to think that you could just put a cap and actually it would actually work. In practice, what is migration? It's usually a function of what's going on in the economy. If your economy is doing well and people actually want to come and work there, and you have a shortage of workers here, which we certainly do right now, shortage of people in the workforce, then you just get migration. That's just the way that this tends to work. And if you weren't to have that, then we would have real trouble filling lots of jobs, filling lots of positions in the UK. We have a shortage post-COVID of positions, of workers for those positions that are needed, particularly in the NHS. And actually a large chunk, one of the largest chunks of that, is people coming in to work in health, whether it's nurses in social care and so on. So these numbers are in no way trivial. They're enormous, as I'm saying, but they are a function really of where the economy is right now, what's happening post-COVID, and really of those kind of the hierarchy of things that actually influence this. Caps is way down on this. The history of caps basically says they don't really work.
What if it was more means tested and you kind of made it stricter, which I guess James cleverly, shortly after becoming Home Secretary, did a little bit, and maybe we haven't got the results of that, and imposed tougher restrictions on what it has to be to have a worker coming from abroad versus at home. I mean, presumably that would just fuel wage inflation to some extent, and we're also trying to shake away inflation.
That's definitely the idea. So you can bring in more stringent caps on various different policies. And I think the government would say, look, when you look at the shape of this, it is starting to flatten off, and that might well be, as a result of some of our policies. Although, to be honest with you, these numbers get revised a lot, Wilf. Sometimes they look like they're kind of going down a bit, and then a revision comes in, and actually that's going up. So for the time being, it doesn't look like any of those policies have had much of a difference. But as I say, we have never seen anything like this. It followed Brexit. It followed a big change in the immigration system. But at the same time, you had COVID. At the same time, you had the aftermath of that. At the same time, you've had these flows of immigrants from Ukraine and Hong Kong. So there is a lot going on. But it's entirely reasonable that we have this conversation because, as I say, we have never seen these numbers looking as high as they are at the moment, and that is a legitimate part of the election debate.